can access the notes that I'm going to be using here to cover the material here in this lesson. So here is lesson 184, and you can follow along right there on your computer with the PDF copy of the notes. So that being said, I want to get right into things today because, as always, we got a lot of ground that we want to cover. So you should have in front of you lesson 184, pre-1611 evidence for the text, the general meaning, and the notes of John Bois, part 6. So this is going to be my last study on the pre-1611 work-in-progress primary source documents that we have that speak to the process on the King James Bible. So if you look at bullet point number 1 under introduction, in lesson 183 we looked at Gerald Hammond's comments on Bois's notes and general meaning found in his book, The Making of the English Bible. In this lesson, I would like to conclude our study of the general meaning by finishing our look at Dr. Edward C. Jacobs' essay, The 2 Stages of Old Testament Translation for the King James Bible. So this is an essay we looked at in the past, and I think when I bring it up here, you'll kind of remember at least seeing some of this. But let's get right into the main point, okay, which is a consideration of this essay, or finishing it. 2 Stages of Old Testament Translation for the King James Bible by Edward C. Jacobs. In lesson 174, as part of our discussion of the impact of Part 1602 on Old Testament readings in the AV, that's the King James, we considered Dr. Edward Jacobs' 1980 essay for the library titled The 2 Stages of Old Testament Translation for the King James Bible, in which he expanded on his arguments from his 1975 essay, An Old Testament Copy Text for the 1611 Bible, and we discussed that in lesson 173. Sylvia, can we note that I need to make that a link to lesson 173 there in the parentheses when I redo these? Okay, thank you. According to his earlier essay from 1975, Dr. Jacobs stated the following in 1980, quote, "This Bible," referring to the document Part 1602, and again, that is the 1602 Bishop's Bible that is in the Bodleian Library in England, that has the handwritten notes of the translators in the margin and interlinear between the lines, where they are editing the 1602 Bishop's Bible to turn it into, or to conform it to what would ultimately be the 1611 King James. So, let's go back to that quote. "This Bible, Part 1602, has copious handwritten annotations throughout much of the Old Testament and New Testament. Scholars have long considered these annotations of little value, but Professor Allen," that would be Ward Allen, "thought otherwise. Under his direction, I studied the Old Testament while he studied the New. My published conclusions argue that the Old Testament annotations represent a valid record of a large portion of the work of the Old Testament translators as it existed in its final state before it was sent to the general meeting for final review. I base such conclusions on 3 sorts of evidence: the bibliographic state of the Bible, the annotator's hand and method, and textual collation of the annotations with the King James Bible and earlier English translations." So again, some very highbrow, heavy lifting, scholarly work has been done related to these documents and figuring some of this stuff out. The purpose of Dr. Jacobs' 1980 essay is stated as follows, quote, "Since establishing these conclusions, I have sought to determine whether the Old Testament annotations can establish quantitatively and qualitatively the amounts and types of revisionary work that the Old Testament companies and the general meeting performed." Okay? So, think about this. If something is quantitative, what are we talking about? How much? The amount. If something is qualitative, we're looking at what type or sort is it, right? So in his essay, he's covering both. He wants to look at, okay, how many changes were made, quantitative, and then second, qualitative, what kinds of changes were made are the 2 issues there. So, in this lesson, we want to review the contents of this important essay, as well as present new material that is pertinent to our discussion of the general meaning. So this first subsection here, I just have titled Review at the bottom of page 1. The first half of Jacobs' essay is devoted to sharing his quantitative findings regarding the number of revisions performed by the translational companies and the general meeting. Go to page 2. This takes the form of presenting a somewhat complicated table accompanied by explanatory text. The following is a copy of Jacob's table, and I will leave the PowerPoint on the screen throughout the lesson and annotate as we proceed. Now, you will notice, guys, those of you that were here last winter when we were going over this originally, you should recall going through this document, or at least I hope you recall doing that, where I made all of these annotations to this handout. Now, do you guys remember doing that or not?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Somebody remembers, makes me feel good. All right. So we went through all of this and we understood it and we unpacked what all of it means. And we did that in a previous lesson. I believe it was lesson 174 that we did that. All right. Now, obviously, if I take the time to redo all this, we're not going to get anywhere new. So I'm putting this up here as an anchor in your mind of what we looked at in the past. Well, remember we looked at group 1, group 2, group 3, and we looked at the quantitative distribution, the number of changes, the totals, and then we were able to look at the total general meeting revisions, and we were able to come to some conclusions based upon this work. Okay? So, let's go back to the notes, page 2. The purpose of group 3, so that's this group right here. This group right here. All right? The purpose of group 3 is to chart how many additional revisions the general meeting provided for each of the 91 verses that it further revised. Okay? So, and then we're going to read this part of it because it's important to get this part. So I will read from it and I will reference stuff here on the chart, and you have a copy of it in your notes as well. Group 3 consists of 4 vertical columns. Column 1 labeled Total General Meeting Revisions. Okay? So that's right here. Total General Meeting Revisions. All right? Shows the total verses and percentages that the general meeting further revised of each translator's company's work. Columns 2 through 4, labeled B2, C2, and D2, employ the same classification numerical scheme established for the work of the translator companies in Group 1. So you see here we have B2, C2, D2. That's not a robot from Star Wars, okay? That's the titles of the columns. Columns B2, C2, and D2 classify the verses that the general meeting further revised according to the number of revisions that the general meeting supplied for each verse. So, column B2, the First Oxford Company states that the general meeting further reviewed 22 of 25 verses of the company's work, but it did so by supplying only minor changes, 1 to 3 words per verse. Column C2, so let's just make sure we understand that. So here's B2. Notice it says 1 to 3. So, of this company, 25 of the 103 verses are revised, so that's 24.3% of the verses. Okay, so that's this number right here. Then you go to B2. Of those revisions, they only change 1 to 3 what? Words. C2, they change 4 to 7 words. D2, they change 8 plus words. All right? So, of the 25, you guys with me? Of the 25 that were changed, can I write on this? Oh, darn it. That was going to be really cool. But anyway, of the 25 that were changed, 22 of them, or 80% of the 25, had only 1 to 3 what? Words changed. Okay, so again, we're talking here about quantitative, number of changes. All right? Then, in this same group, only 1 of the 25, or 4%, had 4 to 7 changes, and then 2 of the 25 had, or 8% had 8 or more what? Changes, okay? So we're getting our bearings now on the chart. You guys remembering when we went over this, okay? And you're all shaking your heads yes, so this makes me feel good. Moving on. Anyway. Column C2 states that the general meeting made moderate revisions of 4 to 7 words for one verse, or for one verse already revised by the company. Column D2 indicates that the general meeting made significant revisions of 8 or more words for 2 verses already revised by the company. So again, that is me just saying what we've already identified on the table or on the chart. Important conclusions follow from an analysis of Group 2. While the general meeting further revised 91 91 of 300 verses, some 30.3% of its revisions were almost totally of a minor sort, quantitatively speaking. Now that's all the way down here, okay? So 91 of the verses, 30.3%, I'm down here at the bottom here, 30.3% of that number, okay, we can see that 81 of them, 89% only had 1 to 3 what? Changes, word changes total for the entire table, okay, back to the notes. For only 10 of the 91 verses, or 10.9%, has the general meeting made more than minor revisions. Thus, there is an inverse relationship between columns D and A of Group 1 and columns B2 through D2 of Group 3. The nature of that relationship is this. In Group 1, 62 of 300 verses, or 20.3% of the verses that the translator companies revise, are in the categories of A and B. So that's down here. Okay? A and B, 20.3%. All right? Where am I at? In Group 1, 238 of 300 verses, or 79.4% of all the verses that the translator companies revise, are in the categories of C and D. So that's right here. Okay? 79.4% are in the categories of C and D. Those being 0 changes, A and B are 0 to only 3 changes. C and D are 4 to 7, or 8 plus. So we see higher percentages here than we see when we look at the work of the general meeting in column 3. That makes sense, because is the general meeting putting the final touch, finishing touches on the work as it is being done. You guys with me so far? Okay? Such a relationship substantiates Professor Allen's answer to a problem that scholars have long pondered. I'm on page 3 in the quote there, second paragraph. Such a relationship substantiates Professor Allen's answer to a problem that scholars have long pondered. How much revisionary work could the general meeting have accomplished in the short span of 9 months or so? Could this committee have done much more than a final assessment of the work of the translator companies? Professor Allen's work translating for King James has answered this question. In particular, his analysis of Bois's notes for 1 Peter argues convincingly that the general meeting paid the closest attention to its task. And the figures regarding the inverse relationships cited above bear out Professor Allen's conclusions. The general meeting reviewed carefully all of the translation work, approved the majority as it stood, some 70% or so, and the remaining 30% that it found lacking supplied mainly minor revisions of 1 to 2 corrections per verse. Based upon these complete sample books, it will not do then to assert that the general meeting revised 30% of the work of the companies. It did not completely revise 30% of the translator's work. Rather, 89% of this figure, or 80 or 91 verses further revised, constitutes only further minor changes of the ones of the 3 revisions. Conceivably, 9 months' work would have been sufficient for the general meeting to review all the work of the companies. Okay? So that's what we went over in the past back in lesson 174, as we sought to establish the quantitative nature of the changes that were made, both by the translational companies of First Oxford, First Westminster, and First Cambridge, compared then against the final or the general meeting as cataloged in column 3. Now, listen, I know I went through that fast, and I know that if you maybe weren't here the first time, you're like, what are you talking about? Okay, but I'm trying to be clear and succinct as far as where we're at. Can we compare and chart the quantitative distribution of changes that are happening to the text by the general meeting? Now, I'm telling you right now, for Jacobs to sit there and do this took him hours. Hours and hours and hours of checking and cross-checking and checking again and again and again and again to figure out where the changes are coming in the process of the revision. Now, before we get into new material, does anybody have any quick clarifying questions about what we just went over in the review? No? All right. Praise the Lord. Halfway through page 3. New material. The second half of Professor Jacobs' paper from 1980 contains a discussion of the qualitative types of linguistic revisions made by the Old Testament companies and the general meeting. In lesson 174, we did not discuss this portion of Dr. Jacobs' essay. I intentionally saved it to consider as part of our discussion of the general meeting. So way back last winter when we did 174, I said we're stopping there, and we're going to talk about the second half of this essay by Dr. Jacobs when we talk about the general meeting and John Bois's notes. And that just happens to be today. Dr. Jacobs describes the collation found in part 2 in his essay as follows. So I'm at the bottom of page 3. Quote, the textual collation follows this methodology. At the left-hand margin appears the name of the sample book. Beneath the name there follows the chapter, verse number from the Bishop's Bible 1602. So I'm going to go ahead to the next slide. Okay. So you can see what we're talking about here. So here we have the name of the book. And here we have the chapter 1, verse what? 4. Verse 4. Okay? Now notice he has DB. That would be a reference back to where? The columns on the previous table. Okay? So he's triangulating that for you. So I'm going to erase that and do that over again. So here we have the name of the book. Here we have the chapter number and the verse number. So we're talking about Nahum, chapter 1, verse 4 in this verse. You with me so far? Okay, back to the notes. Beneath the name there follows the chapter verse number for the Bishop's Bible 1602 for each verse revision that the general meeting has made. From Ruth, Nahum, and Habakkuk are 3 sample books. The Bishop's Bible chapter/verse numbers correspond to the same chapter/verse numbers in the King James Bible. So that verse number there of Nahum, chapter 1, verse 4, would correspond to Nahum, chapter 1, verse 4 in the King James. Admitting that there may be a different number for that verse in the Bishop's Bible. So all the verse numbers are correlating and corresponding with the King James. Okay? But such is not always the case in Song of Solomon. In this book, the translator company has at times revised the verse numbers so that the Bishop's 1602 and the King James Bible do not agree in numbering. So I just mentioned that. To prevent confusion, I indicate wherever necessary in parentheses following the Bishop's Bible chapter verse number, the number of the verse found in the King James Bible. For example, in Song of Solomon, collation begins with chapter 1, verse 2, but it would be chapter 1, verse 3 in the King James, okay? This number indicates that the Bishop's Bible, chapter 1, verse 2, corresponds to the King James Bible, chapter 1, verse 3. In order to tie to table 1, the statistical table in part 2 with the collation, I cite also in the parentheses after each chapter verse number in capital letters, the first letter is either A, C, B/C, or D, and the second letter is either B2, C2, or D2. These 2 groups of letters refer to group 1. There's a typo here somewhere, I think. I need to check this. Refers to groups 1. I think that should be a Roman numeral 2. And 2 respectively in table 1, part 2. And tell how many revisions a translator company has already made for each verse, and how many further revisions the general meeting makes afterward. Nahum 1:4 is followed by D, comma, B2. This designation indicates that the First Oxford Company made 8 or more revisions to Nahum 1:4. So check it out. So here's Nahum 1:4. I already have it underlined here, right? And we see here that it's correlating to column D. So we can go back here, find column D, and see this category is a category where there were 8 or more changes made to that by the First Oxford Company. You following that? Okay? Let's go back. So this designation indicates the First Oxford Company made 8 or more revisions for Nahum 1:4. At the general meeting, and that the general meeting made 3 or less revisions to the verse. In this case, the collation shows the general meeting made 1 change. So notice it says B2. Okay? We can go back here. We can find B2. And we know that B2 means they made 1 to 3 what? Changes. So to Nahum 1 verse 8, the First Oxford Company made 8 plus changes to that verse. The general meeting made 1 more change to that verse at the end of the line, in addition to the 8 plus that had already been made by the First Oxford Company. Following that? Sure. Aileen, you with me? Okay. So, to the right of the name of the sample book, following each chapter verse number, there appears the text of the verse portion under consideration. So if you go back here, you'll see at this line, is the whole verse listed? No. The only part that is listed is the part that is being revised or up for consideration. You following that? Okay? So, back to the notes. First appears the verse as it is printed in the Bishop's Bible, 1602. So this little heading here, BB, stands for what? Bishop's Bible. So, Nahum chapter 1, verse 4, in the Bishop's Bible, the phrase up for consideration here is this phrase right here. The spring also of Libanus, is that how you'd say that? Sure. Is destroyed. The spring also of Libanus is destroyed. Okay, let's go on to the notes. Second appears the verse as revised, if at all, by the translator company. So the OX here stands for Oxford. And you will see here on the second line that they revised what the bishops had. The bishops had the spring also of Libanus is destroyed. And they revised it to the flower of Lebanon is languished. Okay? And then you go to the next line. The third follows the verse as revised by the general meeting. Of course, the King James text that is here cited represents the state of the text as it stood at the end of the work of the general meeting in 1610. So here we have the general meeting. GM stands for general meeting. And you'll notice they alter this further, and they change it to, and the flower of Lebanon languish. What did they take out? They take out is. They change the spelling here of Lebanon, and they strike the word what? Instead of is languished, it just says what? Languished. Okay? So is this verse now revised by the general meeting? So the general meeting is going to revise this verse beyond the revisions that had already been provided by the Oxford Company. Does everybody understand how to read this? Okay? Let's see here. So, the following abbreviations appear. So, BB is Bishop's Bible, OX is First Oxford Company, CB is First Cambridge Company, WM is First Westminster Company, and GM equals General Meeting. Now, the collation cites only those portions of verses that made clear further revisions that the General Meeting has performed. So, everything else is left out. So it's only counting changes made by the general meeting at the end of the line. The parentheses containing the capital letter indicates indicators that follow chapter verse numbers make clear to the reader how much revisionary work the entire verse has received from the translator company before being sent to the general meeting. A reader using a facsimile of the King James Bible together with this collation can determine what the revised state of the entire verse was when it was sent to the general meeting. There is at present no facsimile of a Bishop's Bible 1602. One must use a Bishop's Bible, a microfilm copy, or photographic copies if one wishes to examine the further state of the verse as it was in 1602. Not anymore, because I have a PDF that I pulled off the internet of a 1602 Bishop's Bible. So I don't need to go over there to look at it. I have it in my computer. Okay? Praise the Lord for that. So, is everybody with this? So can we see how many quantitative and qualitative changes are being made? So, if you look at this verse, the Nahum verse that I have marked up, what kind of changes do we see? Do we see a spelling change? We see a spelling change right here. And do we see a linguistic change by the removing of what? Is removed. So now we're not talking about how many changes, now we're looking at what kind of changes. See the difference between the quantitative and the qualitative, okay? A final directive. The revisions that the general meeting performed are summarized in Table 2 following the collation. But after those collated verses below that contain errors made by the annotator, there appears the word comments followed by the phrase error, corrected, class 1 or 2 or 3. These numbers designate 3 classes of errors. Class 1 errors are obvious errors that the annotator has made, such as failure to erase, i.e. line through the text completely, or to supply a complete revised reading for the erased text. Class 3 errors I so designate because the logical or grammatical context of a verse argues that an error exists. Class 3 errors refer to revisions that may or may not be errors or doubtful errors if they have been allowed, if I may be allowed such a contradiction. Such a category is necessary because the verse context does not support an either-or judgment. Some readers may classify some errors of class 3 into class 2 or vice versa. Others may question if errors so classified in 2 or 3 are errors at all. Now understand what he means by errors. He means errors of annotation. So remember, all these annotations, they were made by what? Hand to the text. Sometimes was it hard to tell which way certain things went, just because of ambiguities or uncertainty in how the annotator handled the changes. You following me? Okay? So consider the following examples from Jacob's collation on the book of Nahum, originally revised by the First Oxford Company. So, let's look at a few more of these. This goes on for pages, okay? So we're only looking at a few. So we've already looked at number 4. Let's look at Nahum chapter 1, verse 6. All right? So again, we can triangulate this verse using the D and B2 back to this table, D right here, and B2 right here to know the number of changes that were made. So notice, the Bishop's Bible has his fierceness. The Oxford Company chose not to do what? Revise it. They didn't change it. But did the general meeting make the change from his fierceness to his what? Fury. You see the level that we can look at here. Look at Nahum chapter 1, verse 11. Bishop's Bible. So as thought evil. Oxford Company originally changed it to that imagine. The general meeting changes it to that imagine F. So do they put the ETH on the end? Okay. And then he's got there's a class 1 notation error there in the handwritten notes that Jacobs is noting there. Let's go to chapter 1, verse 13. Chapter 1, verse 13. So notice here we have C and B. So we go back over here. So this verse had 4 to 7 changes in it by the Oxford Company. And then B2, it had only 1 to 3 changes by the revision committee, or the general meeting, I should say. Okay? So let's look at them. I will break. Originally, that phrase was unrevised. And then notice the general meeting changes the word order. They change I will break to what? Will I break? So the change here is word order. The words are the same, but the order is what? Different. That is not technically a quantitative change. That's a qualitative what? Change. All right?
Do you think that changed the context? I mean, because it almost looks like a question in that last entry. But
well, you'd have to read the whole.
Yeah, it may be emphatic.
You have to read the whole verse, but I would not take that as a substantive change in meaning. I would take that as a word order preference in English. You see the difference between those two things?
Yeah, without the context, it's hard to tell.
Yeah. Nahum chapter 2, verse 6. Come on, cooperate with me, please. Chapter 2, verse 6. That's acting weird now. We can go back and look at C. It's the same as the previous one. Let's look at the quantitative. So the Bishop's Bible had the river gates are opened. Oxford Company changed it to the gates of the rivers are what? Opened. And then the general meeting, notice what they do. The gates of the rivers shall be what? Now, shall be changes it from present tense to what? Future tense. So here, do we have a tense change made by the final revision committee? All right, and then one more. We can look at chapter 2, Nahum chapter 2, verse 11. And again, we can go D. So we come over here. D is 8 plus. Were made by the First Oxford Company. B2, so we know that to this verse total, there were made only 1 to 3 changes by the general meeting. Look at the Bishop's Bible. It had the feeding plot of lions' whelps. The Oxford Company changes it to the feeding plot of young lions. And then notice here, the feeding plot of young lions, question mark. And plot is changed. Place is changed. There's a change here too. So we have a punctuation change and a what? So there's a word change there and a punctuation change to this verse. Okay? You guys with me? So Jacob's collation covers 9 pages. He's got 9 pages like what we just looked through in 5 examples. Obviously, I cannot cover all 9 pages with you, nor would you be very happy with me if I did. Okay? We've done it enough, I think, for you to get the point, right? Jacob's collation covers 9 pages, 27 through 36 in the essay. It includes samples from Nahum, Habakkuk, Ruth, and Song of Solomon. In doing so, it compares the work of the First Oxford Company, Cambridge, and Westminster Companies against the textual changes made by the general meeting. Following the collation, Dr. Jacobs presents Table 2, titled Summary of the Textual Revisions Made by the General Meeting. The following images are of that table. So now, notice he goes totally crazy, and he shows us all of the different types of changes. So pages 6 and 7 in your notes match up with what I have up here on the screen. So page 6 is what I have on this, if I'm facing the screen on the left, page 7 is the right. Okay? And you can look at the type of stuff that he's noting here. Okay? Notice, he's talking about verbs being added. He's talking about conjunctions being added, deleted. He's talking somewhere in here about, it's easier for me to see this if I have the, what do I do here? Hang on. There we go. So he's got verbs. He's got noun verbs being added. He's talking about pronouns. He's talking about adjectives being added and deleted. Somewhere in here, he's talking about the revising of clauses, plural and singular revisions. These are the quantitative changes that are made in that whole swath that I just mentioned, okay? And that is, again, 1 Cambridge and Nahum, Habakkuk, Ruth, Song of Solomon, all right? Let's go to page 8. So, in conjunction with table 2, that's what I have on the screen behind me, and what you have in your notes on pages 6 and 7. In conjunction with table 2, Dr. Jacobs offers the following summative observations regarding the work of the general meeting. Study of the textual collation in table 2 gives a clear and certain view of the work of the general meeting. The general meeting truly functioned as a committee of final review for the 6 translator companies. It performed neither massive revisions, nor did it do a cursory task of review. It carefully scrutinized all the work of the companies and found the majority of the revisions to be in good order. But for some 30% it made slight revisions. Table 2 corroborates Table 1 and makes clear the nature and extent of these revisions. 21 spelling revisions of proper nouns account for the single most frequent revision. Okay? Now, where's that on the table? Right here. Spelling changes, proper nouns are the greatest category that they revised. Now, that is an interesting thing to consider when you think about the rules, and I know you all have the rules memorized from way back when. One of the concerns they had was the spelling of names in one of the rules. And I don't even remember which one it is off the top of my head. But for them to be changing the spelling of proper names is an interesting thing given some of the considerations they were given to consider as they did their work. All right? 21 spelling revisions of proper names account for the single most frequent revision. Other categories such as adverb revised, adjective revised, adverb deleted, and preposition added account for 9, 7, 5, and 5 revisions respectively. So that would basically be these categories here, okay? Running down here that I mentioned. So non-revised, he breaks it down pretty clearly into, and then he's got also like the verses and where these things are at if you really want to study that table, which I know you're all going to do this afternoon after church. Maybe not, okay. Study of the qualitative nature of the revisions of the general meeting suggests that it probably did not embroil itself in doctrinal controversy. There just wasn't time for it. Their concern is not to debate the theology of the text primarily. Their concern was to put the final revisions on the text. Any theological debates as to the meaning and reading of the text probably largely happened in the companies themselves as they did the work. So a study of the qualitative nature of the revisions of the general meeting suggests that it probably did not embroil itself in doctrinal controversy. None of its revisions of Song of Solomon, for example, suggest controversy about how to read this difficult Old Testament book. Neither do the revisions for Ruth, Nahum, or Habakkuk appear to alter significantly the English text prepared by the translator companies. The general meeting's revisions function primarily to improve style. Now, isn't that what we already said? Remember we saw how, in Bois's notes, that they had an influence, and they had a decided interest in how the text would sound when it was read out loud in English. So look at that statement. The general meeting's revisions function primarily to improve style. The great majority of the revisions result in more graphic renderings of the text through changes such as the revision of a noun or a verb, the condescending of a phrase, the reworking of a subordinate clause into a coordinate one, or in some cases, the expansion of a phrase or a clause. First Westminster Company's Ruth is the sample book that the General Meeting has revised most significantly. Second, the First Cambridge Company's Song of Solomon. Third, the First Oxford Company's Nahum and Habakkuk. Accepting Habakkuk 2:18, the General Meeting made no significant stylistic revisions of the First Company's work. Revisions such as plot to place, remember we saw that one, let's go back. We noted that one right here, right? Plot to place. Revisions such as plot to place in Nahum 2:11 and stream to overflowing in Habakkuk 3:10 are typical of the General Meeting's revisions of these books. Despite the lapse of over 350 years, we can quarrel with very few of the revisions of the General Meeting. The sample books clearly show us many new aspects of the work of the King James translators, especially that of the General Meeting. Yet more work remains to be done. Other Old Testament books of this annotated Bishop's Bible require study to see if they agree with the findings presented here. And the revisions of the General Meeting need to be studied in relation to earlier English biblical translations and to the Hebrew text available to the translators in order to determine what debts the General Meeting may owe to them. Now, let's stop there. Has this guy done a massive lift to get this far? And he's acknowledging there's still 3 more lifts that still need to be what? Done. To my knowledge, nobody has done these additional lifts. It doesn't mean they haven't been done and I don't know about them, but I don't know of any other essays or scholarly materials that have been written covering those aspects. All right? So, Dr. David Norton offers the following summative statement about the notes of John Bois in a textual history of the King James Bible. Quote, "The second puzzling feature of Bois's notes is that they do not account for all the work that had been done on the epistles and Revelation. Much more work happened between the preparation of manuscript 98 and the printing of the text than his notes account for. 2,974 changes were made independently of the preparation of manuscript 98, but Bois's notes record just under 500 items of discussion, the majority of which concern the originals rather than the particularities of English translation. Even if each of these items of discussion led to a change to the text, which did not happen, they would account for less than a 1/12 of the changes. It may be that it did not record all the discussions he was present at, but somewhere and somehow there's significantly more work to be accounted for." So, look, I know we went through that pretty quick, but I think you guys can get the point, right? There's sort of 2 edges to the sword I want you to think about. Through these documents that we've looked at, Manuscript 98, Part 1602, and the Notes of Bois, do we have far more light and understanding into what actually happened than we would have otherwise? Yes. But even with all we can know from that, do we still know everything there is to know about what happened? The answer is no. Okay, the answer is no. But for Jacobs to sit here and go through all of this, note it, catalog it, and table it out the way that he did is a huge benefit for us to be able to take sample sizes, manageable chunks, and see what was going on with the text. Okay? And it's interesting to me that we have Jacobs doing this kind of work on Old Testament, while we have Bois's notes available to us for Romans through Revelation. And so it's like we get these we get these periodic pictures of the thing as it's happening. When you lay them all out, you can get a very, very good understanding of what happened. But are we always going to have a few gaps and blind spots in knowing exactly what happened in every case? Okay. So, does anybody have any questions or comments about what I've presented here in this particular lesson? Does this make sense to look at? Did we break it down? Did I break it down clearly enough for you to understand what was going on in terms of qualitative versus quantitative changes and the types of things that are going on? Literally, seriously, this thing goes on for like 26 pages of him noting every single thing with the bishops compared against the Bodleian Bible compared against the 1611 to be able to know what kind of changes are being made. Not only quantitative changes, but also qualitative. So, if there are, let me kind of preview where we're going to go next. We've kind of got this thing now to a point where we're on the cusp of seeing the Bible, of the King James being printed. Okay? The first printing is in 1611. So what we're going to study next is the printing and the 1611 as an actual historical artifact of what's in it, because a lot of people don't really even know what was in it, how it was set up, what types of things were in it, and really sort of dissect it. What I'm going to cover next Sunday is once the general meeting, let's just say that this represents their final work. They hand it to two guys. They hand it to a guy named Thomas Bilson and a guy named Miles Smith. It is Bilson and Smith that are going to be responsible for taking their work and seeing that it gets printed by the king's printer the way that they wanted it printed. So there's sort of one last toll gate in this, and that is the work of Miles Smith and Bilson. They are going to do things like write the preface. They're going to write the dedication to King James. They're going to be responsible for the chapter headings that are in the King James Bible at the beginning of every chapter that were in the 1611. They're going to be basically entrusted with the work, such as it was, and see that it got printed. And there are different schools of thought and thinking out there related to what that looked like and how that actually happened. All right. Now, imagine, let me use an illustration with you. So, the notes that you have in front of you, who's the original author of these notes? Me. All right. I sent them to Sylvia and Mike to proofread. All right. Sylvia and Mike proofread them to the extent they were able without having some of the books or essays at their disposal. They made changes. They sent it back to me. I then took their revised copy, saved it, and put it on the internet. You with me so far? What's going to happen next? Sylvia has written down some of the things that I've commented on. She's going to change them, type up a short email, send it back to me to review the changes that I said we needed to make while we were in here teaching it, and then I'm going to revise it, save it again, take down the old one off the internet, and put the new one in its place. Okay? Now, we are able to do that because we have computers. Did they have anything like that in 1611? They did not. We do not know what form the text was in when the translators handed that thing to the printer. We don't know. The original manuscript, whatever form it was in, has not thus far been made aware to us in history. Some people think it was destroyed in the Great Fire of London in the 1660s. We don't know. That's also speculation. But we're going to look at next week what can we know about the text when it left the general meeting and showed up printed in a bound book for the first time. You guys following that? We'll start looking at that next week. Any questions or comments? If there are no questions and comments, we have an absolute rarity around here, and that is that I'm done early. Did you have a question? Oh, okay. Well,
On page 8, you got a quote here in that first paragraph that says very few verses contain major revisions. Does this, Dr. Jacobs provide any information on those major revisions?
yeah, the major revisions would be in this group right here, 8 plus. It would be verses that have 8 or more revisions.
I just wonder what the verses are.
Well, I could send you his essay and you could find them. I mean, we could arrange that if you really.
One example would be plenty, probably.
What's that?
One example would probably be plenty.
Yeah, I mean, but even if I send this to you, Amy, hang on, let me find the right. Even if I send this to you, all this is going to do is look at the phrase or the part of the verse that was changed by the general meeting, not the whole verse. You would have to have the reference, have a 1602 bishops, have a King James 1611, and figure it out, which is probably for one verse would take an hour and a half. I'm guessing, maybe not that long, it might be an exaggeration, but it might not be an exaggeration if you're not used to looking at stuff like this, because the print and the font it almost would look like a foreign language to your eye, just because you're not used to looking at text like that. So number one, you're going to have to read it, decipher the text, what is even being said, and then you're going to have to figure that out and then compare them. I mean, it could be done. I just don't have an example of that per se in the notes. Do you want to do it?
No.
Oh, okay. Darn it.
Bryan, was there any other religions that were trying to confiscate what they were trying to do here so that they wouldn't revise the Bible?
What do you mean confiscate?
Well, trying to get their work that they've done.
Well, we haven't talked about this yet. We just because it would have been an interruption to the flow, but there was a plot called the Gunpowder Plot to assassinate the king. And many folks believe that it was related to this project. The other thing I would say is the Catholics were also working on their own Bible. So the Catholics did the Reims Bible, the New Testament, in 1582. And then they released the Old Testament. So you'll hear it referred to as the Douay Reims. The Reims is technically a reference to the New Testament part of it that was done in 1582. And the Douay, the Old Testament was done at Douay in 1610. So obviously when they started that project in 1582, the King James Bible as we know it was not even a figment in anyone's imagination yet. But the Catholics did have a desire to put out a competing Catholic English translation to the Protestant English Bibles of the day. And their Old Testament is released the year before the 1611 King James Bible is done. So if you hear somebody talk about the Douay Reims, they're talking about the whole thing, Old and New Testament. If you hear somebody just refer to the Reims, they're probably just talking about the New Testament. Okay? All right, anything else? There we go. That was 5 more minutes. We're still early, though.
Was the Catholic Bible
Well,
before
here we
that?
go.
Was the Catholic Bible before that in readable English, or was it
No,
only in Latin?
it was only in Latin. It was only in Latin.
They changed a lot.
And so it was only in Latin. Now Wycliffe in the 1380s did translate the Latin Vulgate into Middle English in the 1380s. But that was handwritten. It was not done on a printing press.
Wasn't available for the mass.
It was not widely available, and the Catholic Church did seek to destroy any and all copies of the Wycliffe Bible they could get their hands on. That becomes obviously much more difficult once printing comes into effect. But anyway, all right, good questions. I'm going to go ahead and shut this video down and pack it up. Next week, we'll start looking at what the translators handed the printer, and